What's going on, Salt Strong Nation? I've got a fun insider report for you guys today. I'm headed down with my buddy Ryan to do a little bit of fishing for trout after a really big winter storm. And as you guys can see, I'm fishing with the new TX2 bait caster reel. This is from 13 Fishing, and I've got a Waterloo Slam Mag. This is my new corky setup, and probably what you're going to see me fishing with for the next couple of months as I target these big winter and early spring trout. Now, I've mainly used spinning reels since I moved to Texas, but after fishing with so many Texas insiders and fishing with a bunch of pros that are around here as well, I have been convinced that when you're fishing corkies, it can possibly be more efficient and less taxing, honestly, on your arms, joints, and everything else if you're using a bait caster reel. As you guys can see here, Ryan's using a bait caster. He's hooked up with a nice red that we got just a few minutes out of the boat. But I'm going to start fishing here and explaining exactly what I'm doing and also kind of sharing some thoughts with you guys about this new setup. So you guys can see Ryan's nice red right here that he picked up on the corky. Again, it's not a lure that's just for big trout. I a lot of times will pick up these nice reds in the shallows when I'm fishing for these trout. But what really we were doing here was just feeling along the edge of this really big shoreline that's protected during these fronts, looking for these fish. Now, we started getting some bites really early. Unfortunately, still getting used to the bait caster and how to set the hook. I've used them before, just have not fished with them enough to really kind of have that second nature of when to set and how to set it properly. I kept setting off to the side. Sometimes I'd get them, sometimes I wouldn't. It's more about creating the right bend with the rods and eyelets, and eventually I started picking some of them up on this edge. Now again, we're looking for these trout in an area that they're going to be protected during the actual fronts themselves. So you guys can see here, the shoreline's over to our left, and the wind had switched, being that we were on a post-frontal day. So you can see it's blowing from the south. Normally it's blowing from the north, and these fish were now warming up. It's still a little bit cool, but they're warming up from the freezing temperatures, and they're getting up in the shallows. So me and Ryan are standing pretty much right on that edge, just throwing these corkies over the side, over that depth change, waiting for these fish to come. So I actually just missed a bite right here, and I'm trying to attract another one. With these corkies, it's really funny. Fish will come back even after you feel that swipe, and they'll try to still come after that bait. It's one of the very few lures that I know of that fish will come back and still actively and aggressively strike. So if you miss a strike, don't automatically reel in your lure. As you guys just saw, what happened there was I just felt the strike, missed it, let it settle back down, and continued my retrieve, and this trout came right back for it. They are very voracious this time of year. They're looking for any easy meals that they can get. So if they've already expended a little bit of effort to go after a meal, they're going to continue to hunt it down and chase it. Sometimes it just takes a little bit more of a slow retrieve. In fact, I imagine it a lot of times as a topwater that is underwater. I a lot of times use the same cadence, the same walk, and if I kind of keep that mindset, if you guys have missed blowups on topwater before, you know to continue working it, and you a lot of times will still get that strike again. So you'll see that happen several times in this video. These fish going and hitting it, and I'll set the hook, and then they'll come back and hit it again. It's just something that I find trout tend to do in the colder months, when if they're willing to expend energy to go after something, they're going to continue to go after it because they've already kind of made the effort to do so. You've got them in a feeding mode. So be sure to keep that in mind when you're fishing corkies next time out and you miss a strike. Let it hang there a little bit longer and then just continue to retrieve per normal, and there's a very good chance that fish will come back and strike again. So I want to cover next my color selection choice. As you guys can see, the clouds that are up in the sky, and you saw that we had really heavy fog in the morning. I chose to go with a white corky because we had changing sets of color conditions and the water was moderately clear. We're fishing over mud bottom, and you guys can see kind of the murkish that's over that trout. It's not super clear in the water looking down in it, but it's also not very dirty. I went with the white just because it's a good all around, because we had a bunch of changing light conditions with the fog burning off and coming around, and the sun being blocked. And I find when I've got a lot of color changes with light or light penetration into the water, white tends to be good because those trout's eyes are having to adjust to a bunch of different shades, and the white is going to take on the shade of whatever is around it, be it the murk or the amount of light that's getting into the water. So if I had gone with, say a more natural color, I would have needed the right light conditions to do that. It would have probably needed to be sunny, and it would have needed to be clear water. But if it was, say dark and it was dirty water, I would have gone with the, dark gold or some darker colors, but instead I went with white just because I knew there was some changing conditions going around, and regardless of what was happening with the sun in the sky, the clouds covering the sun, or even a color change that was going to occur when the winds changed later on, that was what I felt like rolling with. So you guys can see that white right there. Plus, it matches that mullet that I just caught in terms of color, and obviously it's a pretty big bait profile. But another important thing about these corkies is that you want to be bending the tail and the nose if you're trying to work these deeper zones. While the fish that we were after technically were starting to move into a post-frontal pattern, they were still in deep water because the front had not technically broken yet in terms of temperature. We were in freezing temperatures, which put the fish into an absolutely no feeding mode. Now that we were moving into post-front, they were starting to warm up. We were back to some above freezing, but not quite nice and warm, low 70s, high 60s post-front conditions, which is why we're on the edge of the flat rather than further up. I've talked to you guys a lot in recent reports about post-front, you want to be fishing shallow. Before the front, you want to be fishing shallow. During the front, you want to be fishing deep. Right now, we were kind of in that mid zone where the fish weren't quite shallow, but they weren't quite on the other side of the drop-off entirely, which is why Ryan has been picking up some fish, and I've been picking up some fish as well. They're just starting to move into a new pattern is what we found on this day. So luckily, the corkies do allow you to play with both shallow and deep presentations just by how quickly you work them. And that's what I'm going to start talking about next, is just the retrieve for these corkies here. So when you're working the corky, the ultimate goal is to try and get it in the strike zone of the trout that you're targeting. I mean, that might sound a little bit simple, but the corky is actually going to help you find out where that strike zone is by taking patterns from where you're getting strikes in your cadence or how long you're having to wait. There's a lot of things that are going to factor into finding out where the strike zone is. Is it mid-column? Is it near the surface? Is it on the bottom? Do they want it fast? Do they want it slow? And the two ways that I would break down a corky retrieve is into the twitches and pauses. So what I want you guys to pay attention to here is once I get my lure out there, it's on the depth change, I've got it set, it's sinking. What I'm going to do is make several very fast pops, and what that's going to do is make that lure twitch and dart around and imitate that bait fish that I'm after. And then I'm going to pause for several seconds. And throughout this day, it was between 3 to 5 seconds that we had to pause. Sometimes the fish wanted it completely on the bottom, and sometimes they wanted it just a couple inches off the bottom. The corky sinks pretty fast, so you want to try and keep track of how many seconds you're having to wait before you actually hit the bottom. If you find yourself catching grass, take note of how many seconds it's kind of taking before you stop catching grass, and then you'll know where the bottom is, and you can kind of adjust it. I find that normally the sweet spot is about a second, second and a half to 2 seconds off the bottom. That's usually where I get most of my strikes. But on this day, for example, where the trout were completely on the bottom, you'll see a lot of the fish that we caught have mites on their belly. It happened during really long pauses, just like that fish. I believe that one hit on a pause as well, or if not, right after I had finished my pause. So what you want to do is try to figure out what the pattern of the fish that you're after is, because with trout, it's funny, it's almost like you find this formula for what the fish want that day, and once you've keyed into that and you know, I need to be twitching 5 times at this speed, and I need to be waiting 3 seconds between those twitches to get the strikes. It's insane how many times you'll have back-to-back casts and catch fish because you're following the formula. A lot of times they're schooled up and they're just waiting for it to be in the right range for them to strike. So you guys will see me just continue to use this corky and fish it in several different twitches or longer pauses, but what I'll do is make the slight adjustments, and that's how I stay on to fish. And it changes throughout the day, again, like I said, so don't just stick with one thing throughout the day. You'll see it kind of come in waves as the temperature changes or the light changes or the bait availability changes. If you have to move to an area that's got bait that's running on the surface from an area that had bait that was maybe moving over an edge, you're going to see these fish change their patterns as well. Just try not to get a bird's nest like I do. But it's funny, one cool thing that happened here is I got this bird's nest, I threw this out. We were talking about pauses on this day, and I got through that entire bird's nest, reeled it up, and boom, there's a trout sitting there. So like I said, these fish were on the bottom. If that doesn't show you fish that are on the bottom, I sat there for probably 45 seconds picking that bird's nest out, and that fish sat there and just chewed on that corky the whole time. So pretty funny little example there, but just following the pattern of where the fish are, getting it in the strike zone is what's most important. I could fish a paddle tail, I could fish a power prawn, and find something that does some pretty good darting actions, but casting around and finding where the fish are at and the depth that they want to strike is what's most important. Once you've found fish and then figured out where they're striking, that's what's most important. I do like the corky because it's got that nice little dart action that tends to trigger reactions from larger fish a little bit more, which is what we were after. But we did find ourselves in these nice schoolie trout. But as you guys can see, just dialing into the right amount of twitches, the right length of pause was absolutely key to getting as many strikes as we did this day. Now, I've gotten a lot of questions from you guys on how to increase the size of trout that you're catching in the wintertime. Now, my first recommendation to you would be, if what's happening to you guys is happening to me and Ryan right now, you're catching a bunch of small fish, you probably need to move. As you guys will see in this video, I think the biggest fish that we caught was maybe 22 or 23, but I know a lot of you guys are after the really big trout, 25 plus, and those are not going to be hanging around schoolies. They are very solitary fish. When you're catching fish in this volume, a lot of times it's going to be anything in that slot range to up, 22, 23, and you're going to be dealing with fish that are, hanging together for safety from dolphins, and just because they school and feed in that behavior because they haven't figured out how to be, single hunters of larger bait fish yet. They still are in that schooling mentality of small fish where they need to work together to get easy meals on small finger mullet. Basically the corky is just a small finger mullet. But what you're going to see with these larger fish is that they're more solitary. So what me and Ryan were trying to do is continue to wade down really slowly and find the edge of these schools. It's funny, even the smaller trout will be in the same areas as the bigger ones, but they won't be in the exact same spot. So it could be 50 or 75 yards down the shoreline after you've stopped catching schoolies that you lay into a big fish. And that's what a lot of times happened when we found some of these larger trout that day, was we got away from a small school. We're just continuing to wade throughout this video. We'd get away from a small school and then we'd pop a big fish, and then we'd go for several minutes without catching anything, continuing to wade down, and then we'd find another school of small fish that were around this size per se. And I'll say that Ryan found a lot of the larger fish hanging shallow. So one immediate thing that you can do, and I tried to do it later on in the video as well, is just move a couple feet shallow. It could be 6 inches, it could be a foot, but I tend to find that those larger trout are generally going to hang in the shallows. There's some bigger meals up there for them. There's large mullet. You guys can see even there, Ryan had a bigger fish than on average what I've been catching. I've been on the deeper side, but it's just all about looking for where the easy meal for the big fish is going to be. And a lot of times you see big mullet in the shallows that are trapped against the shoreline, trapped against a point, or they're coming out of a drain, which is what we were fishing in front of this day. So we just tried to think about where a big fish would be situating itself. And obviously the conditions were right for trout to be over here. It was a post-frontal day, so those fish are still going to be on a north shoreline. And once it's warming up, they're going to move into the shallows and feed heavily until the next front comes through and forces them back down into the channel. So me and Ryan just again made a small move down the same shoreline, looking for more structure, trying to find some bigger fish between these different small schools of trout. And again, we're back on them on this edge pretty much immediately. We are just getting out of the boat and Ryan's catching more fish. So again, just walking down the shoreline, making more and more casts, trying to figure out the formula as we're getting later in the day. Water's warming up. You can see the winds also dying down as well. And it does switch here later on in the day. This is typically why you see the lower winds in mid-morning. You're going to have some really high winds cranking through later on in the day as that pressure changes. But we just were trying to get onto as many fish as we could before the pressure change occurred. Usually when we see fog burn off midday or a big pressure change happen mid-morning, it shuts the fish down. So we knew we didn't have a whole lot of time to find a bunch of fish, but we wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, being that it was technically a post-front day. So we continued to squeeze ourselves down this shoreline. I actually worked up shallow in this clip you guys are going to see here, trying to look for some of those big trout. Being that Ryan brought me out, I let him have the shallow side, but he was kind enough to let me have a few minutes up there as well when we went to the next spot to see if I could find something up there. Hopefully a big trout. As I hooked into this fish, felt really solid. I remember sitting there thinking, man, this could be a really, really good trout. And then lo and behold, it started kind of doing some drag runs, and I could see that it was a redfish. Now, one thing that I want you guys to take note of here is the size of this redfish and the size of that corky. It just goes to show that fish are used to feeding on larger baits in the wintertime in areas like Baffin Bay or the lower or upper Laguna Madre, where there is not a giant presence of shrimp. Now, in North Texas, that could be different. There are larger populations of shrimp around, and it just seems like fish are a little bit more keyed into feeding on larger bait fish presentations in the winter months when there's not a whole lot of shrimp around in the upper and lower Laguna Madre. So just something to kind of keep in mind. This right here was actually my best fish of the day. I caught it going back to the boat to grab a water, and again, just threw it in between me and the boat. It was the shallowest of water I'd been in all day, and you can see there, chomped that corky real good, and Ryan was actually hooked up with a fish in that clip as well too. But just the shallower situations seem to produce larger fish. So me and Ryan both scooted up a little bit shallower. It seemed like the action was going there as well. But when things start to slow down, you guys can see there's no wind. One thing we were really trying to do is just force some reaction bites. So you see me working that bait way harder, some even more intense pops to just really try and trigger those strikes. Almost like when redfish have something roll by their face and it triggers a reaction. It seems like with trout, the harder the dart, it seems to trigger a harder reaction. But this can be adverse if they're in a really heavy feeding mode where bait is already kind of scared and it doesn't want to give itself away. It seems like I only do this when I don't see a lot of activity. I get really hard pops and I get really aggressive with my presentations, and it seems to trigger strikes. I can't give you a complete reasoning behind it. I think it's just that those fish are more in tune to things, and it just triggers a little bit more of a reaction than when they're feeding. When they're feeding, they're looking for something that's maybe a little bit more scared and more subtle. I don't have the 100% answer there, but this is just kind of what I've observed. So you can see me and Ryan are both hooked up there, two really nice hits, and it's in a period of time when we were expecting to be done for the day. So it was definitely a good day of fishing. I have hundreds of trout that I can show you guys from this day. Me and Ryan absolutely crushed them. All throwing the corky all morning. That white corky was perfect for this color and light situation. Would highly recommend it if you are confused on what color to throw. We do have a darker color corky in the shop. I'd reserve that for just muddy water situations. I really, really do think that the white is probably the best overall color in any situation. I will sometimes use some natural colors if the water is more clear, like silver with a purple back to imitate pinfish, or a silver body with a green back to imitate mullet. It just depends on the situation, but I would say 95% of the time the white corky will work just as well. So this crazy-eyed trout was the last real solid fish that I had of the day, all on that same corky. Tough day for that dude. It was all chewed up by the end of the day when the fog burned off. And once that happened, the bite was pretty much over. I guess it changed the water temperature or just the trout weren't comfortable feeding in that really bright light after feeding all morning in overcast conditions. So we pretty much called it. But if you guys want to find out how to fish the 90-10 zone like we did in this video, check out the link below where we'll show you a personalized video for your area so you can start catching fish fast.